Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today is all about the spice trade. Our essential question for the day is: what role did the spice trade play in European competition for control of Southeast Asia? So let's go back to pre-European times. In Southeast Asia, in about 1500 CE, before the Europeans arrived, mainland Southeast Asia was relatively stable. This was not going to be a place where the Europeans had easy inroads for control. Once you got to the mainland, we had establishing strong monarchies, stable states, not easy pickings. But instead, the easy pickings came out on the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian islands. This area of Southeast Asia was a lot less unified, although there was kind of a power that was throwing its weight around, which was the Sultanate of Malacca. Malacca is a city that sits right around here on the Malaysian Peninsula. This controls this strait right here, the Straits of Malacca, which is access to the Spice Islands or the East Indies, Indonesian islands, whatever we want to call them. This is the area we're talking about for today. And the Sultanate of Malacca is kind of the ones who are the dominant power of the region. Now, most of the spices do come from the islands of Southeast Asia. So that is our focus for this lesson. And the Spice Islands had largely converted to Islam over the years during the expansion of the Islamic Empire, and mostly traded with Arab merchants. It was the Arabs who largely controlled the Indian Ocean trade routes, except for a brief period where the Chinese stuck their nose in and dominated for a bit. But then it went back to the Arabs, who continued to control this. They would then connect the Spice Islands to the Greater Silk Road, and therefore the spices would make their way up to Europe. So this is how the Europeans came to know and enjoy spices from these islands. Now, in the mid-1400s, the Portuguese started to look for a way to sail to the Spice Islands. And this ties back into the idea that the Ottoman Empire was largely shutting down the Silk Road with all their bureaucratic, administrative nonsense and high taxes. Made it very difficult and expensive for the Europeans to get access to the spices, and so they started looking for other ways. Now, it wasn't until 1498 that Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese sailor, becomes the first European to sail ships into the Indian Ocean. And once they arrive, they have a tremendous military advantage. The caravel, which the Portuguese had developed, was the dominant military weapon of the time. And it just absolutely could not, the navies of the area could not compare any ships to the caravel. It was faster, lighter, more heavily armed. It just was an incredible tool of the Portuguese. And so they were able to dominate that region and defeated navy after navy after navy that was sent after them. With this strength, the Portuguese are able to build an Indian Ocean empire. The key battle for them was in 1511, when the Portuguese are able to capture the city of Malacca on the Malay Peninsula. This will, for all intents and purposes, overthrow the Sultanate of Malacca and put the Portuguese in the premier position in the Spice Islands. They now have full access to all those islands, all of those ports, and they sail their navy right in. They destroy whoever decides to stand in their way, and they seize control of port cities throughout all of the East Indies. With control of the port cities and control of all the trade routes in the area, the Portuguese then dominate the Spice Islands and the spice trade for almost 100 years. But the Portuguese were never militarily strong enough to control large areas of territory. They could control the ports, but they could not break their way inland, nor did they give specific intentional efforts to do so, not serious ones anyway. Instead, they would simply buy the spices as the only person buying them now. They could buy the spices from the locals at a low rate and then sell them at a higher rate to somebody else. And this is how the Portuguese made their money. And it worked well for them until the early 1600s. Here, the wealthier and more powerful British and Dutch start to arrive in large numbers to the Spice Islands. Now, the Portuguese will try to control this trade. They'll try to simply force others out, But the Dutch and the British are showing up in such large numbers in heavily armed ships of their own and start to push the Portuguese around. Now, in particular, the Dutch realize that if they themselves can take over these ports and kind of have a home base for their ships to be, this is going to be a huge strategic advantage over the British, who are also their powerful rival. And so they go in and they wind up taking over all these Portuguese ports. The Portuguese really just can't stand up to the Dutch at this period. And the Dutch then start to replace those Portuguese. And once the Dutch have control of the Portuguese ports, they can push the British traders from sea because they don't have the ports to return to. Now, the British do wind up taking a few areas. They're not completely pushed out of the Spice Islands, but the Dutch really come to dominate that region. Just a fun little note. So the Dutch did this first through a company. So they had a business that actually went in and did this. And it was a business that was backed by the Dutch government, but it was run as a semi-private business. And it was one of the wealthiest and most successful businesses in human history. Just for comparison's sake, here's a bar graph showing a lot of big wealthy businesses over time. Here's Apple Computer, and here's the Dutch East India Company. Substantially wealthier than Apple or Microsoft, Standard Oil, IBM, all of these companies that you may have heard of from the modern era compared to the Dutch East India Company. Just a much wealthier, bigger deal. But the East India Company doesn't control it forever. Eventually, the Dutch government will step in and take control of it. And once they do, unlike the Portuguese, the Dutch actually will have the power and the interest in pushing their control over territory. They're not just going to control trade. They want to control the spice land itself and control the land and be in charge of the Indies. They want to turn this into a colony of their own. And gradually over time, and it does take a while, check the dates, they came into the area in the mid 1600s. So by 1800, they're still only controlling ports and small areas of land. But over time, they push their way through, they take over more and more land, and the whole area, which we now call Indonesia, becomes known during that time as the Dutch East Indies. And they control that land until after World War II in 1949, when they finally back out of the region. So that was kind of a quick history of the spice trade and that region. I hope you learned something today, found this informative, and I'll see you next time. Farewell.